when you think of the word judgment, you think of holding to a certain line or standard. But the problem is that if we were to really judge ourselves appropriately, truly, we would actually have a decrease in the amount of critique that we would have for ourselves. And we're back.
We're back. Episode 2.
Episode 2.
What were we drinking today, Dale?
This is... What is this? This is
Olipop. It's ginger ale.
Ginger. Yeah, thank you.
Ginger ale,
Thank
yeah,
you.
which is pretty legit.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
I like it.
Have you had, are you a ginger ale person? Okay.
Through and through.
What was, before Olipop, before
Well,
you
okay.
discovered the wonderful world
So
of
I
Olipop
will say,
soda,
like,
what was your go-to?
I could stand for this to be way spicier. Like,
Okay, you like ginger beer type.
yes, like,
Okay.
so my favorite is actually the ginger beer that they use for a lot of Moscow Mules, like in actual alcoholic drinks. But like,
what brand is that?
So Fever Tree.
Fever Tree. Okay.
Yeah. Fever Tree's probably it's just the most stout.
Yeah.
There's definitely some other ones that are really spicy too, but they're just a little too sweet, and I just like
Yeah.
it, just like pure fire going down your throat.
Yeah. Yeah. Question. When you were in Tanzania,
Yeah.
did you ever try Stony Tangawizi? It's like this brown soda that's like gingery and like super, it like burns your throat.
I wish I had.
I think you would
I would have.
it.
I think I would have remembered it.
Yeah,
if
it's a Coca-Cola brand, but I don't know why
Really?
they don't have it here.
Oh well,
But it just like burn. I mean, it burns.
we need to import it for a show.
Yeah, I'll find it.
Okay,
I'll find it.
okay.
Yeah, so that should be fun.
That I think it will be.
But hopefully this discussion as well should be fun too, because I've been thinking about therapy as it exists today, and as it has developed over the past, I think it's like not even 100 years. Like when we study therapy in school, we go back to like Carl Rogers, Freud. This is like 1990s, right? So it's I guess a relatively new concept in the professional sense. But when I think about it nowadays and how therapy is designed for clients and for individuals, is that you realize that people in many ways judge themselves pretty harshly when it comes to life in general. And at least the tools that we have in therapy are meant to kind of assuage that judgment that I feel like people come in with, and also maybe the fact that therapy is confidential, that it's as a therapist there's this term called unconditional positive regard.
And who came up with that?
Our good friend Carl Rogers.
This guy again.
Right? He's like the father of counseling.
Sure.
Yeah, and it's this idea of when you come into a therapy room, the therapist is supposed to treat you as if they shouldn't judge you. It's supposed to be a non-judgmental space, to regard you positively regardless of what you've done. You can come and share anything, which I think of course has its utility, right? Because therapy is supposed to be the place where you can share anything, right? But I think it just goes to show again, like, the judgment is something as a society we kind of struggle with, right? We're trying to avoid judgment, trying not to give judgment, especially in today's age. It's all about like non-judgment, don't judge. When you're in therapy, we talk about the inner critic. Like, we all have the inner critic, and many people say we have to silence the inner critic because the inner critic is never for you. So it's all about non-judgmentalism. What do you think of that as regards to your approach to helping people and therapy in general?
So let me rephrase the question. So you're asking, what do I think of the concept of whether or not it's realistic to have a non-judgmental space in therapy?
Not even realistic,
Okay.
but if it's a good thing, because I feel like
Yeah.
the unspoken belief is that if we just didn't judge ourselves, then we'd do a lot better in terms of health, happiness, well-being. Like, we're just super judgmental about ourselves and maybe others too, but I guess in this discussion, like, judging ourselves.
I think the funny thing about that is that oftentimes when you think of the word judgment, you think of, okay, holding to a certain line or standard, right? But the problem is that I think if we were to really judge ourselves appropriately, truly, I think we would actually have a decrease in the amount of critique that we would have for ourselves.
Okay, because that's
Yes.
a bit counterintuitive.
Yes. So what I mean by this is to say, and so when I'm going to use the term judgment in a perhaps a slightly different sense. So typically when someone says, "Hey, I'm not going to judge you," no judgment, right? What they mean, or what they perhaps the idea is, hey, you can do whatever you want. I won't say anything. I won't perceive anything towards you, and you do you, effectively, for all pragmatic purposes. The only problem with that is, one, it's not realistic. You have to make judgments in your day-to-day life in order to make any type of decision, right? You make and effectively, I'm antiquating judgments with decisions and informed decisions, right?
So in order to decide, you must
Make a judgment.
judge, right?
Yes, you must make a call, essentially, right? Is this what I want? What I don't want? Is this good? Is this bad? Right? And then what we do with it from there. So to make the statement I initially made on, I think we'd be happier actually if we judged more, right, is a pretty outlandish idea at first, right? But I think it harkens back to the notion of actually taking more responsibility for ourselves than less. You know, it's interesting. You brought up, how old the field is, like as far as counseling or therapy, but I recently got a book that I hadn't read yet by Søren Kierkegaard, and I was reminded that this guy, in essence, was, for all pragmatic purposes, as far as what he did and thought, was very psychological.
Yeah, and he was like back in
Oh,
1800s.
So he wrote the book, The Concept of Anxiety, in 1844, actually.
Wow.
Ironically enough, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So Søren Kierkegaard, like, who? For people.
So
who
sorry,
don't know
yeah.
who
So
he
for
is.
people who don't know, basically he was a philosopher on ideas.
Yeah, I think Scandinavian. That's
Yeah,
His
so-
name is like
yeah.
has like the
So-
little dashes in it.
Yes. So, and Danish, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And so essentially, for all pragmatic purposes, we could just call him, hey, a dude that lived way back in the day that was a philosopher of ideas. That's probably the easiest way to describe him. We could go into some other
Right.
details and thematics, but
Yeah.
for John Doe out there, just know he was a philosopher of ideas. He wrote a lot on different concepts, like about the mind and about morality and about ways of being as people. And he even wrote about even some of the work of Immanuel Kant as well. But that's a little bit of a rabbit trail.
Right.
To come back to this notion, though, of judgment, right? People have been writing about the idea. The reason why I brought him up is because people have been writing about the idea of responsibility for a very long time, and moral responsibility. And I think what happens sometimes when we don't take the appropriate responsibility enough is our inner critic actually becomes even more harsh. Right? And what I mean to say is, this is not, so let me say very clearly, I'm not trying to say, hey, you need to be harder on yourself.
Right.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, it behooves us to take ourselves more seriously and be more responsible with how we speak to ourselves and actually judge how we speak to ourselves. So perhaps the question you need to ask yourself when we think about judgment is, am I judging myself appropriately? Am I making the best decisions towards my own personal responsibility for myself that I can be? And if I get critical, or we could say hypercritical with myself, am I judging myself too harshly? Am I being so harsh that I can no longer then recover? So, for example,
Yeah.
this might look like if I'm say using this in a common day-to-day experience, I might say, I didn't wake up to go to the gym this morning.
Is that a real? Is that a real?
Yes. No, it's definitely happened. Definitely happened.
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly human. I'm not beneath
Yeah.
bowing out towards difficult things, though I try my best not to. But it's certainly a possibility for me. Now, I think that so again, an example would be, okay, didn't wake up to go to the gym this morning. How could I do this again? Here I am again,
Right.
laying in my bed again.
I suck.
Right? These thoughts. Now, I think oftentimes, perhaps people do utilize those terms like I suck, but it's more perhaps a preemanating feeling that happens,
Yeah.
right?
It's the feeling of I suck. You're not saying it, I suck.
Exactly. And that is not a judgment.
It's not a judgment.
No,
What
that's
is
an
it?
emotion.
Ah.
We're permitting emotions now, right, to overtake a decision that we did not make. And what we are not doing actively is we are actively actually not making a judgment on whether or not this is okay. What we are not doing is we're not saying, yeah, no, that's true. I didn't go to the gym this morning.
Right.
What I can do is the next right thing. I can wake up and do some push-ups. Right?
That's a judgment.
That's a judgment. That's a decision.
Yeah.
That's a judgment about how I am going to treat myself, how I am going to treat the scenario.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes, it is also true to say, okay, well, I am just this and that is it.
Right.
Right.
Because maybe that's a judgment in the other direction. Of like,
Sure.
I'm deciding.
Yes,
I didn't go to the gym, therefore
I am a piece of trash.
Yeah, and I can't work out. I'm
But
just not going to work out today.
I think that what happens though when that happens is something very different. But before I go too much further on that, any questions you have in relationship to what I just said here, because perhaps it's different.
Yeah. So, yes, what I'm hearing you say is that we shouldn't throw out the question of judgment, because if we were to truly judge ourselves, it would actually turn out for the better. Because again, what's being thrown around these days is just throw out judgment completely, because when you judge, you're critical, and usually it's like hypercritical, right? But I think what you're alluding at is that there's more than just criticism that takes place when you judge, when you make a decision.
Yes.
That's right.
Well, so I think
yeah.
critique in and of itself is a tool. Judgment is a tool. Criticism is a tool. Right? I mean,
Yeah,
I
it
think
feels much more like it feels more than a tool when you're
Sure.
talking about the
But what was
impact.
what was that second word that you just said in that sentence? It feels.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so this is
People don't like that.
no, they don't.
like
They don't.
the feeling of being criticized, the
Exactly.
feeling of receiving feedback,
Yes.
like even going to a loved one who you know loves you and asking them, "Hey, how am I doing? Is there any way I can be a better husband, spouse, parent?" That's opening up yourself for criticism, and people don't like criticism.
No. And I think in many cases what happens, and I think this will kind of weave us into the next part of this conversation, is that people don't like criticism so much because there's actually an inherent high level of perfectionism that goes on, especially within our society, about how we should be, about the notion that, oh, well, we're not there yet. Come on.
Yeah.
What's the problem? Right? That's not actually hypercritical, even though, yes, it is, but it's not stemming from the notion of judgment. It's actually stemming from the fact that the expectation is one of perfection.
Yeah.
Right? If I go to my loved one and I genuinely desire feedback, I genuinely desire to know, hey, how can I improve myself? What are some things that I'm doing that maybe are working well that are not working well? I should expect that there are going to be some areas that could use improvement. I should not ask a question that I'm not prepared to hear the answer to.
Right. Right.
Right? And if I don't, right, if I'm unprepared to hear that answer, I would say that it suggests that inherently I'm doing something just because I feel that, oh, this is the right thing to do. Right? I should ask for feedback even though I think I'm good. Right? That's coming from a place of, I would say, an improper evaluation.
Yeah.
Right? That's coming from a place of a more perfectionistic ideal. Because if we're truly aware that the values that we have are ones that we will ever strive for continually, then we will be aware that we will never actually achieve them. Therefore, if someone is providing good feedback, there will always be feedback.
There will always be feedback. Oof. That's a
Tough.
hard pill to swallow for many, right? And I mean, even when I think about it too, it kind of feels, there's a part of me that's like, what? There will always be feedback? What are you talking about? Right?
Well, and I think this is
yeah.
what we have to recognize is that this isn't that there's always feedback because other people always have something to say. There should always be feedback because we desire improvement.
Right. Because it can always grow.
Yes, because we accept the fact that, hey, we can always grow. Right? So I would say part of the onus is on us to say, hey, how about this part? Because I don't know about this part. Is that actually doing what I think it's doing? If it's not, okay, so be it.
Yeah. So let's take a step back. Why? So I've been thinking about, like, why is it that we want, why do we desire perfectionism so much?
Oh, man,
Like,
we're on another podcast.
yeah, right.
Okay.
True, because it's like, because at the end of the day, it's like, okay, and I think there is a resistance to that these days with the whole no judgment thing, because a lot of people are like, dude, this perfectionism thing is just too much. So let's just, like, forget about it. No standards, nothing, right? But it's like, why do we desire it so much to be perfect, right? To be above reproach, to be above feedback, to be above improvement.
So I think
Yeah.
one basic notion that we desire it inherently is that we desire to escape. Right?
Yeah.
We desire to be able to not have to have feedback anymore. We desire to be done.
Yeah. We desire to arrive.
Arrive.
Have arrived.
Yes. And I think inherently that is a mistaken ideal. But I'm curious. It sounds like that question for you came from a place
Oh, yeah.
of suspicion in a certain direction. What was that?
Yeah, well, yeah. So, I mean, just looking more into it, I came across a wonderful quote by Brene Brown, and she talks about perfectionism. Right?
Yeah.
Yes, it has a book,
Hey.
The Gifts of Imperfection.
Yeah, it was a great one.
So here she writes, perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to be your best. Perfectionism is the belief that if we look perfect and do everything perfectly, we can minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. Why are you laughing?
It just sounds very familiar with what we're saying.
Yeah, I know, right?
Almost like we
Exactly.
might have read the book before.
Right, exactly. And it's like, and so that's what it's.
Good credit to Brene Brown, by the way, for
Yeah,
that.
you're right.
Some
And
good
it's like
stuff
this.
there.
Yeah, it's like, let's be clear. It's not about wanting to be your best. It's an escape
Yes.
from judgment. And maybe, again, how we define judgment, that's a good question. From criticism, from blame, right? And for many people, like for myself, I don't like conflict in general, even though I know conflict's good for me. Feeling of conflict is, that discomfort that comes with it. And it's like, okay, so if I'm perfect, then I won't have to deal with confrontation and conflict and other people maybe getting angry or getting sad, right?
Yeah.
It's like perfectionism is a way to control an attempt to control the environment around us and how people treat us. But at the end of the day, it is a lost battle.
Well, it's interesting. It's a very illusory idea. And by that, I mean, it's something that can never actually be achieved, but yet we strive for anyways. And we have a word to define. It's like we have a word to define something that's completely undefinable. Right. Which is kind of an oxymoron if you think about it.
Yeah.
Right.
And really what it is, like the word she used is that we're trying to escape pain. And pain, like any other thing, is a feeling. And when if you're either trying to escape something or trying to chase it, that is a feeling. It, like you said, you will not avoid pain by trying to avoid pain.
Yes. I think that's a great point. Say that again.
Yeah. You cannot avoid pain by trying to avoid pain, just like you can't pursue happiness and then get happiness by trying to pursue happiness. Because again, they're both feelings, right? So it's a lost battle from the start.
Yeah. So I think perhaps now, like, and maybe this is the next place or phase to go in this conversation is, okay, we've laid out this groundwork to say, all right, don't do this thing.
Right. What do we do instead?
Yeah. So I think that's where metaphors can be extremely helpful. I believe in the power of metaphors. I also believe, obviously, in the power of words in general. But one of those metaphors that I find very utilitarian in terms of being able to own responsibility for ourselves is the metaphor of the judge and the advocate. And perhaps other people have utilized this before. It's one I started utilizing a long time ago.
For yourself or even with your clients?
For myself and with my clients.
Okay. Yeah.
It was first with myself, so it wasn't actually a tool that I discovered in therapy. It was just a notion that, okay, like, you got somebody with, a mallet sitting up on a board and they're a judge, right? And then because it felt like there was duality, right? You have a part of you that's hypercritical, and then you have a part of you that's like, hey, wait a second, but what about that? Right? And I think oftentimes the trouble that we run into is learning how to balance those two. It's not about getting rid of one or the other. You need both, right? Like, you need to have a sensibility that is driven towards reason. And there needs to also be a sensibility that is driven towards mercy, right? Those two things need to exist. And I would argue they need to exist in order to be a good person. Now, we're talking about good and bad, so we could go off into the weeds there, but I'm going to stay right here for now. So let's just say, okay, we need a judge and we need an advocate. You need a part of you that is able to toe the line and a part of you that is able to self-advocate. And I would say when those two are working together in line and in form, right, then we have balance, right? Then we also don't allow emotions to get in between them to fill the void.
So you're saying emotions can replace both advocate and judge?
I would say 100%.
Yeah.
That's what happens, because we get initially some feeling, right? So first there's this thought, like the judge comes in and is like, well, you didn't do this. Well, that's true, judge. I didn't do it. Well, now I feel like crap, right? That wasn't the intention, The intention was to say, well, you didn't do this. We were supposed to, like, so perhaps you could view this in the sense of saying, okay, you could also view a metaphor of saying you have a clerk that keeps checks and balances of all the things we're supposed to do today.
Yeah.
Right. And it's all their only job is just to be a clerk, and they just add up numbers. That's just what they do.
Yeah.
It's just, say, perhaps a computerized part. Right.
Yeah.
And so when something that we said we were going to do didn't happen, it's like, oh, we didn't do that.
Yeah. Judge comes. That's judge.
That's judge.
Yeah.
Right? You didn't do this. Thanks. I see that. I know that. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
You also didn't do the dishes. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Right. I also didn't.
Also didn't.
Yeah.
Right? You fill in the blank.
Yeah.
But this is where now I would say the separate part is, okay, our emotions can start to run away with this.
Right.
I
So are you saying our emotions are often subject to our judge within us?
I would say if we're not careful, our emotions react instead of respond to our judge. Right?
Yeah.
And this is where the advocate can come into play
Right.
to step in as we could say intercessory, right? In between to say, yep, I hear you, judge. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is when we will be doing that. So you can put that on the docket. Judge says, okay, good to go. Right.
Yeah.
But if we're not careful, if there is no advocate, then the emotions just run wild.
Right.
Forget you, judge.
Or
Yeah.
judge, you're right. I am condemned
You're
to
right. I'm done.
damnation.
Yeah.
I will never be.
I will forever sit in sorrow and wallow.
Yeah.
You are self-criticizing now.
Yeah.
We said we weren't going to do that.
Yeah.
Judge.
Yeah. So advocate needs to come into the picture.
Yeah. So, and this is where I would say that advocate needs to come into the picture, but also I would say, and this is what I alluded to earlier in the beginning of the conversation, I think it's okay for the judge also to be strong enough to say, and perhaps to also own the notion that, like, all right, if we're now, and this is where the metaphor shifts from a metaphor to rather a just think about it this way.
Yeah.
And that's to say that, look, if pragmatically speaking, I'm going to judge myself for not doing something, the purpose in that is for self-improvement, right? If I'm going to hold a standard, that standard exists so that I can have self-improvement, right? If that starts to work against me, that is no longer improving me. I need to be sure that my chief aim is self-improvement. So therefore, the judge would work to ensure that that happens. Right?
Right. They serve those values.
Exactly.
Both judge and advocate.
Both judge and advocate, first and foremost, serve the values
Yeah.
that are instilled.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we're talking like, okay, like these values are in place. Like we're sitting here talking, and obviously we have like a Judeo-Christian perspective on this.
Yeah.
So like those values are God-given. However, again, regardless, like even if, say, you weren't from that
Yeah.
theological orientation, you would still say the same thing, right?
Right.
The ends would still work to serve those values.
Right.
And so
Like
I think
if it's like kindness,
Exactly.
honesty, sobriety, maybe for many people.
Yes.
Like this comes into play a lot with addiction, is where the judges are working overtime. With especially like you talk about someone in recovery, and they relapse. That judge comes in like he's never come in before, right? And it's one of those interesting things where it's like you've been, so let's say you're trying to get off of alcohol, for example, and you've been sober 85 days, because they say the first 90 days are usually when you're most likely to relapse.
usually within the first 90 days after rehab.
Yeah, after rehab.
Yeah.
Right. So day 85. You've been sober 85 days, and then you relapse. It's like, dude, I was like on a good streak, And I forgot the specific term, but there's a term for it, is that be preparing one for that situation where you do relapse and don't live according to your standard and choose to partake. That can, how you respond in that moment can really influence the trajectory of whether you're like, dude, well, we tried.
100%.
We tried, so we're just going to go back.
Well, and
versus, like judge and advocate, like, hey,
well,
you know what? That wasn't what we wanted to do, and let's just put that drink away and move on, right?
Exactly. Right. I think this is where it's really the emotions that we're talking about, right?
Yes.
In the sense that, okay, the judge made the judgment. We had a reaction to that judgment. Mm-hmm. Almost as if you could also view it in the light of saying, like, it's like a child with a parent, right? We have our inner parent, rather, that is just saying things. And then our inner child, metaphorically speaking, is just reacting to them, right? Mm-hmm. And we forget that we're actually the parent of both. And we have the ability to dictate both.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And discern and decide.
Yeah.
This is how I'm going to respond instead of react.
Right. So it's really putting emotions in the right place too.
Yes.
That emotions are data points.
Yes.
Not the emotion itself is not
so
the judge itself.
Exactly.
Which I think we equate with the same. Emotion is the judge.
I think that's the biggest problem.
Like, I feel bad, therefore I am bad.
Yes. Yes. And so so in therapy speak, right, we'd have this another perspective or orientation called acceptance and commitment therapy, right?
Yeah.
Which is very much in line with what we're talking about now, but it's effectively, for those of you who don't know, basically this is just another modality or like another type of therapy that's used inside of a therapy practice or orientation. But it relies heavily on the use of metaphors so that people can understand how to think about something. And one of the metaphors that's used really frequently, especially for, say, inner critic, high judgment, right? That also, like, and I think when I was taught this, like, I don't think it's even clearly stated enough, but it's very much in the vein that we're talking about now, that it's not about the judge itself, but it's about the emotions predicating the decision, right? The emotions responding to the judge, if you will.
So the judge gets a bad rap.
Exactly. All he did was make a decision, right?
Yeah.
Or he held you accountable, or he said, hey,
Yeah.
you did this, by the way. Like,
Yeah.
he helped you be not a pathological liar.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Because you go on the other side of that. Advocate without judge is, I guess, narcissism. in a way, right?
You could say that, or anything is permissible,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And I would say that its meaninglessness is actually perhaps more appropriate.
Wow.
Right?
That's
I would say
scary.
advocate without the judge is like just utter meaninglessness.
That's scary.
Right? Because
which is unfortunately a lot of what's happening in many people's lives today.
Right. So I would say
lack of meaning.
Yes, and perhaps anything becomes permissible, and so we just permit anything that we have at our whim. I would say that's the other end of the spectrum that's very dangerous and it's dangerous because you become void of meaning.
Yeah.
And value.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, true. Because, when you think about things like boundaries, in order for something to have a definition, it must have boundaries.
Exactly.
Like this cup is a cup because of the dimensions and the boundaries that cause it to be a cup.
It holds something.
It holds something. Yeah, it holds something. Like the sun is the sun because it's like, of course from here it's like a big circle in the sky, but you know what I'm saying? Like we need to have boundaries in order to call something what it is.
Sure.
And in many ways, the judge does that. The judge names things. The judge helps define things, both from a moral standpoint and just like, look, this is this is that. So without it, it's like, okay, now we can't define. What do we define?
Yes.
And that's the meaninglessness that you're talking about, I think.
Yes.
can be pretty. I mean, then your emotions freak out to that too.
Go wherever.
Emotions are
Yeah.
like, dude, what do we do with this?
So the metaphor I was bringing up in that example of acceptance and commitment therapy, so it's a metaphor called passengers on a bus, right? So basically, if you think about, okay, if you imagine your brain is a bus, right? Your, say, conscience, and in this category, we could say our judge is in the driver's seat, and let's say your judge and your advocate are in the driver's seat, right? Maybe there's two drivers, they take turns, right? They're in the driver's seat. Your emotions are passengers on the bus, right? And what happens in many cases to where, let's say, the judge is just pushed out of the seat, the emotions take control of the bus and they steer it wherever they want to.
Steer it off the bridge.
Right. What happens when the advocate perhaps is not in the seat at all? The emotions get thrown to the back of the bus and the bus just doesn't move now. Right? Or rather, it has no passengers, nothing to carry. We need emotion still. Right? So the metaphor is this essentially, like, or rather the utility in this metaphor is this, that when we have a strong emotional impulse, the idea is that many times we don't know how to confront those emotions. We don't know how to speak to ourselves in a way that's going to be realistic, functional, and utilitarian, right? Or just to say, you don't know how to talk to yourself nice, right?
Right.
Or you don't know how to talk to yourself in a way that treats you as someone that you respect and that you can be kind to and still hold a standard to, right? Because if we think about it in terms of, say, a real friend, right? I don't want a friend that is simply going to blow smoke. That's not useful. I need a friend that is going to, yes, support me 100%, but also help me toe the line if there's something that I'm doing that doesn't align with the values that I profess. I would argue that same utility that same utility is what makes, say, marriage such a beneficial thing. Right? Your spouse ideally is someone that can, hey, support you in any endeavor, but perhaps in some endeavors says, you know what, this is a terrible idea, and this is why. Or rather, I don't like how you did that.
Yeah. I love you, and I don't like how you did that.
Exactly, because two things can be true at once. So going back to that, like passengers on a bus, part of that exercise is, quite literally, as a therapist, you might have your client sit in a seat, say that ideally it's one of those like twirly seats that like rotates.
Yeah.
But they sit in this seat and you sit in a seat right behind them. And you mimic all their emotions. So first, before you do this, you'd write up on the board all the negative emotions that they experience in a day, right? Let's say about a certain activity they're trying to do. And you try to like glean all of those that you can. And then you sit down, your client sits in the seat, spins around, you sit right behind them. And then you just start whispering in their ear all of these little terrible things that they think about them, or rather that they feel in a moment.
They feel.
Right. And then you pause and you say, okay, how do you feel hearing this? And it's like, obviously they don't like it. Especially it's weird to have somebody sitting right behind you saying these things that you think yourself, but you're just like, what in the world? I don't like this. Yeah. This is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right? Because it is uncomfortable. Ideally, then what happens is you then say and offer up this script, rather. You say, look, when I start saying these things behind you as your emotions would, I want you to turn. I want you to face me. And I want you to tell me, look, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. I'm still going to drive the bus. You can go take a seat. We're going to be okay. I'm going to go this way. You're going to sit comfortably right there. And we're going to be all right. And ideally, you also want to check in with, literally, how does it feel to sit and confront somebody that's saying things, even though they're things about you, but how does that, like,
Yeah.
What's that experience like?
To hear
Because
from someone else.
to hear
Is
from
that the
someone
saying?
else, and then
Or to
also for yourself to say, okay, as I turn and say this, like, it's like, oh, I gotta
yeah.
say it. Like, I have to
Yeah.
say, I hear you. I have to stop you from speaking, even though you're talking kind of loud, right?
Ah.
Because usually for most people, even though it's a weird experience, there's still something about turning, facing, interrupting, and speaking, right? If I can turn to face that which disturbs and confront with utility, I can have growth.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting analogy. Passengers on a bus, and then the twirly
Yeah,
chair.
it's
That's
super.
good.
You don't have to use a toilet
Yeah,
chair,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it works really well when you do that.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's good. I mean, like I think about it in my own life. I recently adopted the practice of journaling. Is
Great thing.
it's hard to do. I know for many people it's not a thing for them.
Yeah.
And for me, it's a way of kind of doing that.
Yeah.
Because usually I tend to just not try to think about my feelings, even though I'm feeling them and I can't run away from them, right? Like I don't confront, I don't face, and oftentimes a lot facing them for me is I need to pause, oftentimes, and writing for me helps like bring those feelings out and I like enunciate them, because otherwise it's just like it's noise. It feels like noise in my head.
Yeah.
And so right now, like, hey, what am I feeling right now? Like what's happened to make me feel this way? Has there anything happened? Like, is there a decision I made, haven't made? Like, what's happened to make me feel this way, right? And what's this? Then I'll like, okay, what's the story my emotions are telling me? Like, what are the beliefs
Good
I'm
Brene
adopting?
Brown incorporation.
Hey, come on now, come on now.
The stories we
yeah,
tell
I'm a
ourselves.
story dude. I'm
Hey,
a story dude. Like,
excellent.
thinking stories, movies, everything, and then that piece of like, okay, but my emotions they're not the driver here. What are the values that I want to live by, and will dictate how I respond to the situation, regardless of whether the feeling is saying that or not. And that is the action that I want to take, right? And I think many times myself, and I think most people feel like by confronting, it's going to be overwhelming. So I guess the question I have is like, do you think then that sometimes it's helpful to have another person work through that with yourself to help practice that skill? Because it's like, dude, I can't, man, if I confront those emotions, dude, I don't know if I'll be able to it feels like going into a black hole, not being able to come out of it.
Yeah. So I think that yes is the short answer. I think
Yeah.
that if the resources are so low that perhaps we're stuck in this loop and pattern so significantly that we can't, if like for all like metaphorical purposes, we can't turn and face. That's where, yeah, ideally you can have someone walk through that process with you.
Yeah.
That, but I think this is where it's really important that you will respond to when they try to give cue to say, all right, like we're gonna practice this.
Yeah.
This is how we would interact, right? And so I think short answer, yes.
Yeah.
I think that can be helpful.
Yeah.
Right. I think another part of this too, that would be important to point out with how and I don't think it's just in today's society. I think this has been an ongoing thing. But if we're not careful, we start emulating perhaps what I would call like subtle forms of, and you could call them like, well, I don't like the term covert narcissism because I think that's overused a lot.
Yeah,
but it
narcissism in general
is
is
highly
that word
overused.
is
Yeah, it's a buzzword, and we'll
yeah.
talk about that.
Therapy speak.
Yeah, therapy. Okay, so basically, though, like we like, or rather, we sometimes get caught in the trap of trying to be the best at being the worst.
Trying to be the best at being the worst.
Yes. What I mean by that is someone gives us a compliment and we might say, "Oh no, I'm not that good. Thank you, but I'm not that good. Thank you." And we like shrug it off as
Oh
some
yeah,
as
like
almost
receiving compliments.
exactly
that's
right.
so hard.
Receiving compliments is like an uncomfortable thing,
Yeah,
right?
like,
Because
it's almost like a
especially
bad thing. Like,
if
hey,
we don't feel good about ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
we don't want to feel this compliment coming our way. Most often because we feel that it's not true.
Mm-hmm.
But who said we hold the market on truth,
Come on now.
right?
Yeah.
Because when we say to someone, let's say we're a gifted musician and someone hears our work that we don't know and they come and offer up a compliment and we say, no, it wasn't that good, but thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Who made you the authority on good? Do you even know who you're talking to? Maybe that person has been playing for 25 years and they work at a conservatory.
Their professor.
You know, do you,
Yeah.
or maybe hey,
Yeah.
maybe they're a top chart artist or something, what have you.
Yeah.
But who are you
Yeah.
to predicate, especially in terms of taste, right? For someone to say, "Hey, I really liked that. Thank you." Who are you to say?
Nah. Yeah. It wasn't that good, but
Yeah.
yeah.
And where we really see this also, so obviously in music this happens, right? But I would say inherently musicians are highly perfectionistic.
Yeah.
Anything with creative style, artists, musicians,
Yeah.
right? You could even argue that like forms of folks in the
Martial
jiu-jitsu realm,
arts,
highly perfectionistic
Yeah.
attitudes, right? Towards achievement.
Mm-hmm.
But yet let's to give another example.
And that's sorry. Just
Yeah,
to
go
pause
for
you.
it.
And that's an interesting irony is that most high achievers are most critical of themselves. Like they're highly critical, highly perfectionistic, as you would say.
Yeah.
And for many people that they can't divorce the two. It's like, but if I'm not this way, then I'm not gonna achieve. But at the same time, my achievements are never good enough. Right? Because I'm always looking at the gap, right? There's this author called I think it's Dan Sullivan, but he wrote a book
Mind
called
the
The
Gap.
Gap in the Gain.
Oh, the gap in the
Yeah,
gain.
Gap in the Gain. It's like you're always in the gap. There's always more that you haven't done. You've finished everything on your to-do list, but there's still more you could have done, right? Always raising the bar, but in a perfectionistic way. Like there is a static point I will get to, but I just don't seem to get there. Right? So like musicians, artists, high achievers.
Yeah.
Yeah. What were you saying?
Well, so I think one thing that it's important, especially with music, with high achievers, is that I think if you look at some of the people in the world that have, say, broken the most records, and well, that might be disputable, but I would say that perhaps rather some of the more famous ones. So
Michael Phelps swimming. Would
I'm
you say
actually
that?
also thinking of Sir Roger Bannister.
Okay.
Do you know who Sir Roger
I
Bannister?
don't.
So he was a runner, right? First runner to break the 4-minute mile, or rather,
okay,
like,
okay. Yeah,
and
yeah,
so,
yeah. Mhm.
like, and at that time, like, that was an incredible feat,
Yes.
right? Incredible.
Yes.
People were like, we never thought this would be
Impossible.
possible. People were like, okay, yeah, you could run 5 minute, right, great, but like, get down to 4, it's like, and break that threshold, it's like you're moving, right? Now, Sir Roger Bannister was asked about like, okay, well, why do you run, right? And his comment to that was, we run because we can't help ourselves. Right? We enjoy it for the joy, right? What it does.
Wow.
right? The meaning and purpose he had behind his craft and what he did preeminated everything that he did. When you were thinking about what you desire to do in your craft,
Yeah.
will you allow it to be from a place of meaning, purpose, and joy that drives everything that you do? Because that will carry you so much further than only for the purpose of high achievement.
Yeah.
Right? And arguably, there is even greater meaning in experiencing loss. Right?
With that
Yes.
mindset.
Yes. Well, because I think of the quote, "Man in the arena."
Right.
Right.
It's another one on
Teddy
the
Roosevelt.
walls
It's
here.
on the wall
Yeah,
over
it's on
here.
the wall here.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna grab it. I'm gonna grab it.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna grab it.
Yep.
Appreciate the long awaited pause here, but
Yeah.
we're talking about critics, right? And we're talking about unhelpful emotions driving the bus, right? And we're also talking about, okay, so people who perform, achieve, striving to achieve always. But this is, and I think Teddy did a great job with this. Obviously,
Teddy.
Yeah. So,
Oh, Teddy.
So, again, he writes this "Man in the Arena" speech, right? And this is, I think, particularly poignant when we're talking about the concept of hypercritic, right?
Yeah.
Hypercritical. And I would argue when we're talking about the concept of emotions pushing criticism.
Right.
Right.
That's what. Right. That's when hypercritic becomes hypercritic.
Yes.
The emotions just drive it.
Drive
put it into
everything.
overdrive.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what he says here in The Man in the Arena, it's not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither knew victory nor defeat.
So good.
Nail on the head.
So good.
He hit it. He hit it.
He hit it, man.
Right?
Yeah.
It was excellent.
Man in the arena.
Yes. And I think of that whenever I think of, whether it be myself, 100% guilty of this, guilty of allowing my emotions to drive the bus and steer my mentality towards a place that's not helpful or productive.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'd consider you a high achiever, too. So
Well, thank you.
I feel like we're
I
all
appreciate
vulnerable
that.
Too. Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Which makes you probably vulnerable to that
Yes.
hypercriticism,
But
right?
so if I was not exercising good value there, I would have said, no, I'm not that good, right? Like, thank you.
Yeah.
Right? But in truth, though, like, I think that poem speaks to the notion that, no, like, this isn't about only high achievement, right?
Yeah.
He says, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold, timid souls who neither knew victory nor defeat. Right?
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
hits home.
Yeah, that hits home so good because it reminds me of C.S. Lewis talking about this idea of perfectionism, and it's like, okay, then if you're not gonna be perfect, then just don't try at all, right? That's usually how the perfectionistic mind will think. Yeah. But it's like it's not a question of whether it's possible or impossible, right? Because oftentimes you'll be like, "Well, it's impossible." That should not be the question. That should not be the dichotomy. The dichotomy is it worth it or not worth it? Is it when you're the way he puts it is that when you have an exam and you have an optional question versus a compulsory question, the optional question is like, okay, if I choose to answer this question and I get negative marks, then I'll know I didn't do well. So I'll just choose not to do it. But with a compulsory exam, you
And
have
tell us
to
what
answer.
yeah, tell
You
us
have
what
to
that is.
answer the
Tell us what
question.
that is. So what's a compulsory exam?
Exam?
Yeah.
Well, life. Life is a compulsory
Excellent. Okay.
exam.
Yeah.
Right?
Meaning what? Meaning what? Like if
There's,
there's cost whether or not.
yeah. Whether you're not,
Yes.
you're there. Yeah. We're here. You can't just like, well, people can opt out, but life is there.
There's cost regardless.
There's cost regardless. There's cost regardless. So when it's a compulsory exam, you might as well do your best. Right? You might as well go in dare greatly, as Roosevelt would say.
Yeah.
Right?
Which again, credit to Brene Brown. She also wrote a book, Daring Greatly.
Daring greatly, which she took from this.
Yeah,
which
she
took
did.
from that
She
quote.
did take
She
from
did
this
take from
quote, yeah.
Roosevelt's quote.
Yeah.
And that's a great book too.
Yeah, it is.
And yeah, it's like the man in. It's just to be in the arena.
Yeah.
Right? It's to embrace it.
Yeah.
And with that, like, it's again, you're not like the judge advocate. You know, we are bringing in those two into it,
Yeah.
and it's worth it. It's worth it, even amidst the failure and the highs and the lows. It's like I can think of so many things. Like I don't regret the scary, that confrontation.
Yeah.
Like I never regret it.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
we talked about a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
Judge, advocate, judgment, perfectionism.
Yeah.
I think we hit it.
Hope so.
Until next time.
Until next time.